The air in Blackwood Creek always tasted of pine and stale water, a mix that should have been refreshing, but to the handful of people who lived there, felt more like a low, perpetual sigh. It was a place where things were easily forgotten, mostly by design. Ethan Cole, a freelance investigative journalist with a reputation for chasing the stories others abandoned, parked his battered Ford Ranger outside the only establishment that doubled as a gas station, diner, and post office. The vehicle's engine ticked as it cooled, the sound offensively loud in the oppressive silence. Ethan felt the weight of the town settle on him immediately, a heavy, expectant silence that seemed to precede a storm. He was here for the Goler clan. The story had been a whisper, an obscure footnote in a decades-old police blotter from upstate New York, close to the Canadian border. The Golers were a notoriously reclusive family, known for their strict, almost medieval isolation, and, more darkly, for a long history of severe congenital defects linked to persistent inbreeding. Ethan wasn't interested in a sensationalist exposé. He wanted the human drama, the psychological horror of a family trapped by its own toxic tradition. The interior of the diner was dimly lit, smelling of old grease and weak coffee. A woman with a tired face and hands stained by years of hard work was wiping down the counter. Her name, according to the chipped plastic tag on her faded apron, was Martha. "Coffee black," Ethan requested, sliding onto a vinyl stool that squeaked under his weight. Martha poured the coffee without a word, her eyes, small and guarded, flicking over Ethan's city slicker attire. "You ain't from around here." It wasn't a question. "Just passing through," Ethan lied smoothly, taking a slow sip of the scalding liquid. "Looking for some local history. I heard this area has some old families, deep roots." Martha scoffed, placing the pot back on the burner with a decisive clatter. "Roots, yeah, more like weeds. You mean the Golers." The immediate blunt mention of the family surprised Ethan. He had expected denial or vague redirection. "Goler? The name sounds vaguely familiar. They live out that way?" He vaguely gestured towards the dense, dark forest that edged the small settlement. "Nobody lives out that way by choice," Martha muttered, leaning on the counter. "They keep to themselves, always have. Since their grandfathers came down from Canada, they got their own rules, their own way of doing things. You leave 'em be, mister. That's the first rule of Blackwood Creek." Ethan noticed the subtle shift in her voice, a mix of fear and deep-seated resignation. It was the sound of a community that had made a silent pact to ignore the rot at its core. "I respect that," Ethan said, pushing a $20 bill across the counter. "But as a historian, I find these isolated communities fascinating. Any local records? Old newspaper clippings?" Martha pocketed the bill without looking at it. "History here is mostly told in whispers and empty fields. You won't find books on the Golers. They burn what they don't want seen. If you really want to know about them, talk to Sheriff Brody. He's the one who has to clean up their messes. He'll tell you to turn around, too." Ethan spent the rest of the afternoon driving the winding, unpaved roads, the Ranger's tires crunching gravel. The landscape became increasingly untamed, the trees closing in like walls. He was looking for the Goler property, an isolated homestead rumored to be several miles deeper into the wilderness. He finally found it, not by a sign or a mailbox, but by the sudden, chilling change in the atmosphere. The road abruptly ended, replaced by a barely discernible dirt track that plunged into a shadowed grove of ancient oaks. A crudely built wooden gate, heavily bolted and scarred, marked the boundary. Behind the gate, the air felt colder, damper. There was no sound of machinery, no sight of domesticated animals, just a profound, unsettling silence. Ethan felt a prickle of unease, not the fear of the unknown, but the deeply human, primal fear of something profoundly wrong. As he stared at the gate, an old, rusted pickup truck appeared from the depths of the forest, rumbling slowly towards him. The vehicle was a relic, covered in caked mud. Behind the wheel sat a man whose face was a collection of hard angles and distrust, his eyes set too close together. He looked to be in his late 20s, but his gaze was ancient and vacant. He stopped the truck right at the gate, blocking the track completely. "You're on Goler land." The man's voice was a low, gravelly rasp. It was an accusation, not a warning. Ethan remained calm, keeping his hands visible. "Just lost. Looking for the main road." The man didn't move, didn't blink. He just stared, his expression a blank, intimidating wall. "The main road is behind you. Turn around." The psychological pressure was immediate. This was not a simple confrontation. It was a territorial defense built on generations of suspicion and isolation. Ethan knew that any wrong move, any sign of disrespect, could escalate quickly. He saw a flicker of something raw and deeply disturbed in the man's eyes. The quiet madness of someone who has lived too long outside the boundaries of normal society. Ethan slowly reversed the Ranger, the gravel spitting beneath his tires. He could feel the Goler man's gaze on him until the trees obscured the view. He knew then that the Golers were aware of his presence and that his investigation would not be a simple matter of interviews and archives. It was a trespass, and they viewed him as a threat. Driving back toward the town limits, Ethan realized he hadn't just stumbled upon a story. He had stepped into a silent war zone. The Goler tradition of endogamy wasn't just a historical oddity resulting in physical defects. It was a mechanism of control, a self-imposed prison designed to maintain absolute secrecy and power within the clan. He pulled over near a small abandoned church that was slowly succumbing to the elements, its wooden spire leaning precariously. The sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long, menacing shadows across the valley. Ethan reached for his laptop and opened a new document, titling it "The Goler Problem." He typed a single line, a thought that chilled him more than the silent man at the gate. The true horror here isn't the physical decay, it's the psychological infection passed down. The knowledge that you are a prisoner of your own bloodline, with no escape. This story is just beginning, and the darkness of Blackwood Creek is deeper than any forest. If you're ready to uncover the secrets of the Goler clan, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Don't miss the next chapter of this terrifying, realistic investigation. Sheriff Brody's office was located in a prefabricated trailer parked next to the dilapidated town hall. The room was small, suffocating, and reeked of stale cigarette smoke and desperation. Brody himself was a man built of hard labor and broken expectations. His uniform hung loose on his frame, and the lines around his eyes were etched deep by years of sleepless nights. Ethan sat across the metal desk, which was cluttered with confusing paperwork and a half-eaten sandwich. The air conditioning unit rattled incessantly, a mechanical, nervous tremor in the background. "Martha told me you'd be stopping by," Brody began, his voice flat and worn, like old leather. He didn't offer a handshake. "I told her to tell you to drive back to wherever you came from. I appreciate the concern, Sheriff, but I'm a journalist. I follow stories." Brody stared at him, a look of profound pity and exhaustion. "The Goler family isn't a story, son. They're a cancer on this town, and you're not a doctor." He reached under the desk and pulled out a manila folder, thick and yellowed. He slammed it down, the sound echoing in the small office. "This is their record. Property disputes, animal cruelty, petty theft, assaults that miraculously get dropped by the victim. And one very cold, very old missing persons case." Ethan felt a surge of professional adrenaline. "Missing persons? Who?" "Elara Vance," Brody said, his gaze fixed on the file. "She was the daughter of the local doctor who tried to set up a clinic here 20 years ago. Smart kid, just finished college. She was hired to tutor the Goler children, or, well, the few who weren't too far gone to be taught basic reading. She went on to the compound. She was found near the compound 6 months after she disappeared. Not Elara. Her clothes, folded neatly on a rock near the stream that runs from their land. No body, no signs of struggle, just gone. Brody opened the file, revealing a faded photograph of a smiling, earnest young woman with bright, hopeful eyes that contrasted tragically with the grim reality of Blackwood Creek. And the Golers? They were questioned? They answered by standing at their gate with rifles and silence. The judge was useless. He cited community rights and private land protection. We had nothing but suspicion. We had no body. Brody leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. But I know what happened, Mr. Cole. She saw something. She saw the truth of their cycle, the real reason for their isolation. Which is, Ethan pressed, his heart pounding a steady, investigative rhythm. The inbreeding, the isolation. It's not just to keep the blood pure or whatever twisted code they have. It's to control the information. To make sure no one outside knows the full extent of what they do. To keep their property. To keep their power. Ilara was teaching the children. She was giving them a window out. And the head of the clan, Silas Goler, he shut that window. Permanently. Ethan absorbed the gravity of the information. The Goler cycle wasn't merely a tradition, it was a mechanism of psychological and physical imprisonment, violently enforced. The disappearance of Ilara Vance wasn't an accident, it was a message. Is Silas still the head? Silas died about 10 years ago. Now it's his son, Jed Goler. The one who stopped you at the gate yesterday. He's worse. Quiet, calculated, he controls everything. The lumber, the trapping, the small-scale corruption, with the few business owners who dare deal with them. Brody pushed the file towards Ethan. Take it. Make copies. But if they ever find out you have it, I swear I never gave it to you. Ethan carefully took the file. The weight of it felt like a moral burden. Why tell me this now, Sheriff? Brody sighed, running a hand over his tired face. Because I'm retiring next month. And I'm tired of cleaning up their messes, tired of the fear in this town. I need a journalist to do what the law couldn't. Just be careful, Cole. Jed Goler isn't a hothead. He's a trap setter. He watches, he waits, and he uses the secrets of his own family, their deformities, their isolation, as a weapon against anyone who gets close. The conversation was interrupted by the urgent squawk of the police radio on Brody's desk. Static-laced words filtered through. Male found off County Road 42. Confused. Wandering. Looks like one of them. Brody's posture immediately stiffened. He grabbed his keys and belt gun. Gotta go. That's 10 miles west. Another Goler problem. They usually don't wander off unless something big is happening on the compound. Ethan watched the sheriff rush out, leaving him alone with the heavy file and the rattling air conditioner. He flipped open the folder to the crime scene photos of Ilara's clothes. They were folded with an unnatural precision, almost ceremonially. It wasn't a warning of violence. It was a statement of ultimate, chilling control. Ethan realized the Golers weren't just isolated. They were staging a performance of secrecy. The true terror was not what they were hiding, but the organized, calculating nature of their silence. He had to find a way to penetrate their psychological defenses. And the only way to do that was through their community, the very people Martha and Brody were sworn to protect. He needed an insider. He knew that the cycle of endogamy and isolation had to have fractured the family unit internally. There had to be a Goler who wanted out, who was psychologically desperate enough to talk. He just needed to find the crack in the wall. The town of Blackwood Creek was the buffer, but the Golers themselves were the key. The stage was set for a deep descent into the family's abyss. The next step was a return to the gate, but this time he wouldn't be driving away so easily. The next morning, Ethan returned to the edge of the Goler property. Instead of driving up to the main gate, he parked the Ranger half a mile away and proceeded on foot, keeping to the dense tree line. He was hunting for the crack Sheriff Brody alluded to, a Goler who hadn't fully succumbed to the clan's psychological programming. The forest floor was a treacherous mix of pine needles and sharp stones. The air was thick and still, carrying the distant, unsettling sound of a logging saw, evidence of the Goler's industry. Ethan used the old, faint stream mentioned in Ilara Vance's file as his guide. After an hour of careful hiking, he found a structure, a small, dilapidated shack separated from the main compound by a dense copse of evergreens. It was too small to be a main house, perhaps a workshop or a storage shed. But a wisp of smoke curled lazily from its rusty chimney, indicating it was currently occupied. Ethan cautiously approached, adrenaline sharpening his senses. He noticed something unusual, a small, carefully tended patch of wildflowers growing near the door, a tiny splash of color in the monochrome bleakness of the Goler land. It was a detail that spoke of individuality, of a desire for beauty that defied the clan's barren existence. He heard a low, raspy singing coming from inside, a tune that sounded ancient and mournful. Ethan knocked lightly, his heart hammering against his ribs. Silence. Then, a shuffling sound. The door creaked open, revealing a woman who looked old, but whose eyes suggested she was perhaps only in her 40s. Her facial features were noticeably asymmetrical, the clear physical marks of the clan's cycle, but her expression was one of profound, weary intelligence. Her hair, the color of dried wheat, was tied back severely. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice surprisingly soft, though laced with suspicion. She was holding a worn, simple wooden doll, which she quickly tucked behind her back. "My name is Ethan Cole. I'm a journalist. I was told I might find someone who could tell me about the history of this place." She looked past him, into the woods, clearly terrified of being seen speaking to an outsider. "There is no history here. Only dust and silence. You need to leave. If Jed finds you." She trailed off, the implicit threat hanging heavy. Ethan took a risk, leaning closer. "I know about Ilara Vance." The name struck her like a physical blow. Her eyes widened, and her hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp. "Go, now." "Please, I'm not here to hurt anyone. I'm here because I saw the police file. I saw what happened to her, and I think you know the truth," Ethan pleaded, his voice earnest and low. "Ilara was trying to help one of you, wasn't she? Maybe one of the children." The woman, whose name Ethan would later learn was Sarah, the Goler patriarch's cousin, swayed slightly. The sight of her raw fear was more powerful than any locked gate. "She was helping little Thomas," Sarah whispered, her eyes filling with tears that didn't fall. "He was different. He didn't have the hard face, the cold heart. He was gentle. Ilara was teaching him how to write letters, how to read books about the world outside. She gave him hope. And Jed found out? Silas. It was old Silas then, but Jed was his right hand. He hated the hope, said it was poison, said the cycle must not be broken. When they found Ilara's things, they made it look like she ran away, went crazy, abandoned the town. Sarah's voice broke. But I saw the fear in Thomas's eyes the day she disappeared. He knew. He was a child, only 10. And they made him watch the cover-up. Ethan felt a genuine chill. This wasn't just physical crime. It was systemic psychological abuse, a deliberate crushing of the spirit to enforce compliance. The Goler tradition of endogamy was a means to an end, controlling the minds of the next generation through a shared, isolated trauma. "Where is Thomas now?" Sarah's expression became one of intense, crushing grief. "He is one of the silent ones. They took his hope. They took his language. He's 20 now, lives in the main house. You won't recognize him. He stares at the wall. He can't speak much. They broke the thread." Ethan understood. Little Thomas was the broken thread, the person closest to escaping the Goler mindset, but who was brutally pulled back. He was the most profound victim of their abominable tradition. "Sarah," Ethan spoke her name gently. I need help. I need to know how they maintain the secrecy. How do they keep the entire clan and this town silent? Sarah wiped her face with the back of her sleeve, her resolve hardening slightly. It's the documents. Their marriage records, their births, their land deeds. They keep a private record, a book. It's the only proof of the generations, the secrets, the true names of the fathers and mothers. If that book ever got out, the cycle would be ruined. The local government couldn't ignore the clear proof of decades of crimes. Where is this book? In the old homestead, in Silas's locked study. Jed has the key. It's what gives him his power. It's the history they want to burn. A loud, sharp sound of metal hitting metal echoed from the woods, the closing of the main gate. Sarah gasped, her eyes wide with panic. Jed is back. He's near. Get out now, Ethan. Please, I've said too much. Go to the abandoned church on the main road. I sometimes go there to pray. If I can, I will leave you something. A map, a note. Just go. Ethan nodded quickly, recognizing the authentic terror in her voice. He backed away into the thick foliage, not running, but moving with the stealth of a startled deer. He had found his insider, the key to the psychological prison, but the prison keeper, Jed Goler, was now back on the property, and the walls were closing in. He had the target, the Book of Secrets. The difficulty now lay in the physical and psychological maze of the Goler compound itself. The survival of this single conversation depended on his silence and Sarah's. The psychological game had escalated from simple surveillance to an active, immediate threat. Ethan drove back to the abandoned church, his hands tight on the steering wheel, replaying the conversation with Sarah. He knew he had put her in danger, but her desperate need to speak the truth was a powerful human fuel. He had to assume Jed Goler was already suspicious. He parked and checked the area around the church. The small wooden structure looked even more desolate in the midday sun. It was a perfect spot for an exchange, far enough from town to be discreet, close enough to be accessible. Underneath a loose, lichen-covered stone at the base of the crumbling steps, he found it. A small, tightly folded piece of linen cloth, not paper, which would stand up better to the damp. It was Sarah's promised contribution. Unfolding it inside his truck, Ethan found a crudely drawn, yet surprisingly detailed map of the Goler compound. It showed the main house, the barns, the stream, and the various paths. A small, dark X marked the location of Silas's study, and beside it, an accompanying note scrawled in faint pencil. Study is in the old cellar. Entrance behind the stacked firewood near the smokehouse. Key is not with Jed. It is in the main house, hidden in the portrait of Grandmother Goler in the kitchen. She was the only one who tried to run. They made her a symbol of their obedience. Trust no one else. T needs to know the world is real. The note was a devastating piece of psychological insight. The clan didn't just lock up their secrets. They turned the failure of their rebels into symbols of their oppression. Grandmother Goler, the runner, now watched over them, a constant reminder of the futility of escape. The key being hidden in her portrait was a powerful, sick joke. Ethan spent the next few hours studying the map. The main house was surrounded by high, rickety fences and visible paths, making a direct approach suicidal. The Golers were vigilant, and the few windows of the main house seemed to watch the world like vacant, judgmental eyes. He realized the Goler security wasn't high-tech. It was human. The clan members, isolated and distrustful of all outsiders, served as their own constant paranoid surveillance system. The psychological control made every member a willing or unwilling guard. His plan had to be built on stealth and timing. He needed a distraction, something that would draw Jed and his most able-bodied relatives away from the main homestead. Ethan drove back to Blackwood Creek and went straight to the general store, the only place to buy supplies, and, more importantly, to listen. The air was tense. The community was clearly still buzzing about the wandering Goler found earlier that morning, a man now identified as Jed's cousin, Caleb. "They've taken Caleb back," Martha, the diner owner, whispered to him while filling his thermos. "Sheriff Brody brought him to the main house. They're all there now inside. They don't like when one of them gets seen by the normal folk. Makes them look weak." Ethan saw his opportunity. The psychological disruption of Caleb's public appearance had caused an internal meeting, focusing the clan's attention on damage control and internal security, likely leaving certain areas of the property momentarily less guarded. He stocked up on essentials: gloves, a flashlight, wire cutters, and a small, high-powered camera for documenting the book. He also purchased a cheap, noisy chainsaw. The noise, he reasoned, would be the perfect cover for his infiltration. As dusk began to bleed into the sky, painting the woods in shades of bruised purple and heavy shadow, Ethan drove to the far western perimeter of the Goler land, the opposite side from the main gate Jed had guarded. He cut the engine of his Ranger and waited. The isolation here was absolute, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the distant howl of the wind through the pines. He started the chainsaw. The motor roared to life, a grating, loud intrusion on the silence. He started cutting a dead, fallen log he had strategically placed near the boundary earlier, making it sound like he was a random, very noisy logger working late. The noise was enough to mask the sounds of his movements, but not so close as to immediately draw direct suspicion to the main house. Under the cover of the chainsaw's relentless, grinding noise, Ethan used the wire cutters to carefully snip a section of the perimeter fence far from the compound. He slipped through the gap and moved into the dense woods, immediately feeling the chill of trespass. Following Sarah's map, he moved toward the smokehouse. The compound came into view, a collection of weathered, gray structures clustered together. The main house a towering silhouette against the fading light. No lights were visible. They were likely meeting by lamplight or in the cellar, keeping their discussions truly private. He reached the back of the smokehouse. Piles of firewood were stacked haphazardly against the wall. With his flashlight held firmly under his arm, Ethan began to move the logs, his hands raw and calloused after only minutes of work. He moved as quickly and silently as possible, the chainsaw's distant drone his only friend. Beneath the last layer of wood, he found a small iron-banded wooden door, almost perfectly camouflaged. It was secured by a heavy, traditional bolt, easily slid open. The air rushing out of the cellar was cold, musty, and carried the smell of earth and something indefinable, something old and sealed away. The first physical obstacle was overcome. Now came the true danger. The main house, the kitchen, and the key hidden within the symbolic prison of Grandmother Goler's portrait. The silence of the night, now that he was deep inside the property, felt menacing. A heavy blanket that could be ripped away at any second, exposing him to the calculating malice of Jed Goler. He knew that the family's psychology was the strongest lock, and he was about to try and pick it. Ethan emerged from the cellar entrance into a cold, dark corridor. The air here was thicker, carrying the scent of wood smoke and something acrid, almost metallic. He was now beneath the main Goler house, a chilling location for an intruder. Following Sarah's map, he moved along the rough stone floor, his flashlight beam catching cobwebs and ancient dust. He found the steps leading up into the main floor of the house, a narrow, rickety staircase that creaked ominously with every step, despite his efforts at stealth. He paused at the top of the stairs, pressing his ear against the thin wooden door. Silence. The meeting must still be ongoing, likely in a different wing of the house. He pushed the door open, slipping into a kitchen that felt frozen in time. The kitchen was large, sparse, and dimly lit by a single dirty window. The appliances were decades old, and the air was heavy with the smell of unwashed dishes and cured meats. Ethan's flashlight cut through the gloom, seeking the portrait. It was exactly where Sarah said it would be, hanging above the main, long-scarred wooden table where the Golers ate. The portrait was old, oil on canvas, depicting a stern-faced woman in a severe black dress, Grandmother Goler. Her eyes, painted with an unsettling realism, seemed to follow Ethan's every move, fulfilling her symbolic duty as the clan's silent guardian against freedom. The sight of the woman, meant to embody the futility of escape, sent a profound shiver down Ethan's spine. This was pure psychological warfare, generations deep. He climbed carefully onto the table, trying to distribute his weight to avoid a loud protest from the ancient wood. He reached the heavy, ornate frame. The canvas was taut, but Ethan ran his fingers along the edge, feeling for the key. He found a slight, almost invisible gap in the thick wooden backing of the frame. He carefully worked his finger into the gap and pulled. A small, tarnished brass key, intricately cut, slid out into his palm. It was cold and heavy. The key not just to a cellar door, but to the entire Goler history. As he slipped off the table, the old refrigerator in the corner suddenly clicked and groaned as its motor kicked in. The sudden noise, loud and aggressive in the stillness, nearly sent Ethan to the floor. He froze, heart pounding, straining to hear if the noise had carried through the thick walls to the rest of the house. He heard nothing but the ongoing mechanical hum of the refrigerator. He had the key. Now, the main objective, the study, and the book. He quickly retraced his steps, moving back down the creaking staircase into the cold cellar. The stone corridor was confusing. The map indicated the study was at the far end, behind what looked like a makeshift pantry. He reached a heavy wooden door secured with an old, solid lock, the kind that required a large, specific key. The key from the portrait slid in and turned with a solid, satisfying clunk. Ethan pushed the door open. The air in the room was drier, warmer, smelling strongly of old paper and leather. He was in Silas Goler's study. It was a narrow room lined with crude wooden shelving, filled not with books, but with metal tins, jars of preserved items and piles of documents secured with twine. In the center of a small, dusty writing desk sat the object of his search. A large, leather-bound volume, blackened with age, its covers warped and cracked. It was unmarked, unadorned, yet its presence was overwhelming. The Book of Secrets. Ethan pulled on his gloves and approached the desk. He had to be quick. He needed to photograph every page. He opened the heavy cover. The first page was a meticulously handwritten lineage, dated from 1880, detailing the arrival of the Goler progenitors from Canada. Subsequent pages were filled with names, dates of birth, and marriage notes. The entries quickly became more disturbing. Alongside the names were chilling notations, recorded in the same careful script. 1934, daughter Mary, defect of eye, mated with cousin Thomas, age 17, preserved the line. 1955, son Silas, defect of hand, married sister Clara, lineage reinforced, no outsider interference. 1979, infant male, deceased at birth, severe facial deformation, cause of death listed as natural. 1985, birth of Jed, weak intellect but strong will, trained in discipline, must maintain isolation. 1998, child of Sarah, female, healthy, separated and kept from general teaching, needs to be protected from truth. The book was a clinical record of decades of human misery, a chilling document of the family's enforced endogamy, designed not just to continue the line, but to actively cull and control its members. The true horror was in the cold, bureaucratic language used to describe acts of generational abuse. Ethan began photographing the pages rapidly, his camera shutter clicking softly. He knew the risk was immense, but the evidence was irrefutable. This was not a rumor. It was a self-written family constitution of psychological and genetic oppression. Suddenly, a sound cut through the silence outside the study door. Not the refrigerator, but a distant, muffled thump-thump-thump from the floor above, the sound of heavy boots. The meeting was over. They were moving. Ethan's heart seized. He had mere seconds. He quickly photographed the last few pages, closed the book, and silently slipped the key into his pocket. He was exposed, trapped in the cellar, directly beneath the main house. The hunter, Jed Goler, was now inside the psychological prison, and the prey was caught in the act. The entire operation had turned from an infiltration into a desperate escape. Ethan quickly extinguished his flashlight and flattened himself against the cold, stone wall of the study, listening intently. The heavy footsteps upstairs were clearly audible now, moving through the kitchen directly above the cellar. He could hear low, indistinct voices, the Goler men. They sounded irritated, their voices gravelly and low like stones grinding against each other. Jed is back in the house. He knew he couldn't risk moving yet. The slightest sound, a shifted foot, a rattle of the door handle, would betray his position. He was relying on the Golers' contempt for the cellar, a place they likely only visited for their grim record-keeping. A single, distinct voice cut through the others. It was louder, more deliberate. Jed Goler. Ethan couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, commanding, hostile, and utterly devoid of warmth. Jed was asserting his dominance, likely still agitated about Caleb's embarrassing public appearance. Then, the footsteps began to move, sounding like they were heading toward the living areas. Ethan let out a slow, controlled breath, allowing himself a moment of relief. Just as he was about to make his move, he heard a new sound, one that chilled him to the bone. A soft, shuffling gait, followed by a low, almost inhuman whisper coming from the corridor outside the study. Not gone. Elara. Not gone. It was little Thomas, the broken thread, the boy Elara tried to save. He was wandering the cellar, talking to himself, reliving the trauma that had shattered his mind. Ethan flattened himself further, pressing his body into the shadow. He could see a shape moving past the crack in the doorframe. Thomas was gaunt, his movements slow and clumsy. He was clearly developmentally stunted, both physically and mentally, a tragic monument to the Goler cycle. Thomas stopped directly outside the study door. He was close enough for Ethan to hear his ragged breathing. The air thickened with danger. Thomas was a Goler, and his programmed obedience, however fractured, could still lead him to raise an alarm. Thomas suddenly stopped whispering. He slowly reached out a hand, his fingers twitching, and touched the brass doorknob of the study. He paused, his head cocked slightly as if sensing the presence of the outsider, or perhaps just the lingering memory of his own lost hope in this dark place. The silence stretched, agonizingly. Ethan gripped his camera, ready to defend himself, but primarily focused on remaining absolutely still. He saw the psychological terror in Thomas's eyes, even from the small gap in the door. He was a prisoner who had forgotten how to recognize freedom. Finally, Thomas whimpered, a lost, small sound, and slowly withdrew his hand. He shuffled away, continuing his broken record mantra into the darkness. Not gone. Not gone. Ethan waited until Thomas's steps faded completely before moving. The encounter was a terrifying reminder that the Golers were not just cold-blooded criminals, but victims of their own culture, some of them damaged beyond repair. It underscored the absolute necessity of exposing the book. He quietly unlocked the study door and slipped out, moving back along the stone corridor toward the smokehouse entrance. He ascended the few steps to the main floor entrance. He had to replace the key in the portrait, or the deception would be immediately exposed. He crept back into the kitchen. The light was better now, as a dim oil lamp had been lit on a side counter. He moved quickly to the table, climbed up, and replaced the key behind the portrait of Grandmother Goler. The cold gaze of the painted woman seemed to approve of the successful act of subversion. He descended the stairs back into the cellar. As he approached the door hidden behind the firewood, he heard it. A new set of footsteps, faster and more purposeful, heading towards the cellar. Jed. He was returning. Ethan didn't hesitate. He pulled the wooden door open, slipped through, and began frantically stacking the firewood back into place. He worked against the clock, logs rolling and thudding with small muffled noises that sounded deafening in the silence. He had just managed to replace the final, heavy layer of wood when he heard the scrape of boots on the stone floor right behind the smokehouse wall. Jed was standing a few feet away, surveying the area, his suspicions likely raised by some small, unidentifiable anomaly. A displaced shadow, a stray scent of cologne. Ethan froze, holding his breath, listening to the heavy, slow breathing on the other side of the wood. The psychological pressure was unbearable. The wall of wood was the only thing separating him from a violent confrontation with the clan leader, a man who believed his family's survival depended on silence and ruthlessness. Jed took a single step closer. Ethan heard a low, irritated grunt. Then the heavy footfalls moved away, returning toward the main house. He had been inspected and, miraculously, passed. Ethan waited 5 long minutes before slowly, carefully, pulling himself away from the woodpile. He moved like a shadow, making his way back through the dense foliage towards the perimeter fence. The roar of his abandoned chainsaw was now a beacon, a signal of both cover and risk. He reached the section of cut fence and slipped through. He didn't run. He walked with measured, steady steps back to his truck, the weight of the tiny camera containing the images of the Book of Secrets feeling heavier than the entire Goler compound. He had the proof. But the real game was only beginning, because Jed Goler knew, on some visceral animal level, that his isolation had been breached. The psychological trap had now been sprung on both sides. Ethan made it back to his truck, his body exhausted, his mind racing. He started the engine, leaving the abandoned chainsaw behind as a decoy, and drove away from the compound, the gravel spitting under his tires. He drove straight to a small motel 10 miles away, far from Blackwood Creek. He needed to process the information, secure the evidence, and establish a plan for its release. The moment he got to his room, he downloaded the images from the camera. The photographs of the Goler Book of Secrets were crisp, clear, and horrifying. The clinical details of decades of forced endogamy, the records of hidden births, deliberate disabilities, and the casual notes of oppression and death provided irrefutable evidence of a multi-generational crime against humanity. This wasn't just a local scandal, it was national news. He sat on the bed staring at the pages on his laptop screen, feeling a heavy weight of moral victory mixed with profound exhaustion. He had risked everything, and he had the truth. The next morning, Ethan drove back to Blackwood Creek. He needed to speak to Sarah again, to ensure her safety, and to thank her. He also needed to see Sheriff Brody, to show him the proof and enlist his official protection before he went public. He found Brody's trailer office locked. A note was taped to the door. Out on assignment, county line. Feeling a prickle of unease, Ethan drove to the diner. Martha was behind the counter, her expression even more drawn than before. "Where's the sheriff, Martha?" She wiped the counter with a cloth, avoiding his eyes. He took his vacation early, Mr. Cole. Said he needed to leave this place for good. He left last night. Ethan felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. Brody leaving the night after the Goler meeting was too coincidental. "Did he say anything to you?" "Only that you should get out of town. He said that once the Golers think you've seen too much, they don't wait for the law. They use the only law they respect, their own silence." Ethan realized that Brody hadn't just retired. He had fled. The sheriff's sudden departure was a tacit admission that the proof wasn't enough to overcome the local political machinery and the Golers' violent reach. Brody had dumped the burden on Ethan and left the field. He decided to check the abandoned church to see if Sarah had left any sign. As he approached the turnoff, he saw a vehicle parked in the thicket, a dark sedan he didn't recognize. He parked his Ranger a discreet distance away and proceeded on foot, moving carefully through the trees. As he got closer to the church, he heard voices. Low, intense, and utterly familiar. "You should have kept your mouth shut, Sarah." The voice was Jed Goler's, raw and venomous. "You broke the cycle. You let the outsider in." Ethan froze behind the trunk of a massive oak tree. He could see them clearly. Sarah, standing rigidly against the side of the church, her face pale with terror. And Jed, standing over her, his eyes like chips of granite, radiating calculated malice. "I just wanted Thomas to know the truth," Sarah whispered, her voice cracking. "I wanted the pain to end. The pain is the only truth that holds us together," Jed hissed, grabbing her arm with surprising force. "The outside world destroyed our grandparents. Our way is survival. You gave him the key. You broke grandmother's seal." Ethan realized the horrific truth. Sarah had not merely been found out, she had been betrayed. Jed hadn't just suspected an outsider. He must have been alerted to Sarah's weakness, her longing for escape. The betrayal had to come from within the small, traumatized community of Blackwood Creek. Just then, a third figure stepped out from the shadows of the church, moving toward Jed and Sarah. It was Martha, the weary diner owner. She wasn't carrying a coffee pot. She was holding a heavy, rusted metal pipe. Her tired face was twisted not with fear, but with a cold, desperate loyalty. "She always was the weak one, Jed," Martha said, her voice flat. "Always praying, always looking out instead of in. I told you he was asking too many questions, but I only knew she talked to him when I saw her at the creek, near the old boundary. She was leaving a sign for him." Ethan felt a crushing, sickening wave of realization. Martha wasn't a victim, she was an accomplice, a willing participant in the Goler system of psychological control and isolation. She hadn't warned him. She had been feeding Jed information, maintaining the town's terrified, complicit silence. She had played the weary local, drawing him into a false sense of security while setting him up for surveillance. This was the core of the psychological horror. The Goler contagion had spread beyond the family's bloodline, infecting the community's morals, turning neighbors into snitches and guardians of a terrible secret. Jed smiled, a terrible, chilling grimace that revealed the full extent of his calculated cruelty. "See, Sarah, the world doesn't want your truth. It wants peace, and peace means silence." He looked directly at Martha. "Take her back to the compound. Tell the family. She needs to be taught a new tradition." Martha nodded, gripping the pipe, and roughly steered a sobbing, defeated Sarah toward the dark sedan. The sound of Sarah's genuine, heartbreaking cries for Thomas were the sound of hope dying. Ethan was now trapped, his cover blown, the evidence secure, but his only local ally defeated and his location compromised. He watched them drive away, his hands trembling with rage and fear. He couldn't intervene without risking the evidence, the only thing that could save Sarah and the others. He had exposed the psychological cycle of the Goler clan, but now he was caught in their real-world web of local corruption and community complicity. The story was no longer just about the book. It was about the network of silence that allowed the cycle to continue. The terrifying secrets of the Goler clan are now exposed, but the danger for Ethan and Sarah is only escalating. The veil of secrecy has been ripped away, revealing the dark heart of the community. Before we move on, if you've been gripped by this story, ensure you've pressed that subscribe button. Your support helps us continue to uncover the most disturbing, realistic tales of human darkness. Don't miss what happens next. Ethan knew he was running on borrowed time. He had the photos, but Jed Goler now knew exactly who he was, and that Sarah had betrayed the clan. Jed would assume Ethan had the truth, and his next move would be swift and ruthless. The town of Blackwood Creek was no longer a resource. It was a hostile environment, with Martha acting as Jed's eyes and ears. He drove out of Blackwood Creek immediately, heading to the nearest small city an hour away. He needed to find a safe location to upload the files and reach out to his editor, ensuring the information was backed up and ready for release. He rented a secured office space for a few hours. As he plugged in his laptop, his phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number. The Ranger, blue, license plate R89421, leave town now. They know where you slept last night. Go far. S. The message was from Brody. Even in his flight, the sheriff was still trying to maintain some thin veil of ethical responsibility. The message confirmed Ethan's fears. Jed had the means to track him, likely through corrupted police records or local contacts like Martha. Ethan quickly backed up the Goler files to a cloud server and sent a cryptic email to his editor using a specific code phrase they had established. The Northwoods project is complete, ready for immediate publication of the full record. The key is in the image files. Prepare for pushback. This ensured the editor would have access to the materials immediately if Ethan vanished. With the files secured, Ethan realized he couldn't leave yet. He couldn't abandon Sarah, who had sacrificed her freedom for the truth. He had exposed the mechanism of the Goler's psychological prison, but he had to see the cycle broken entirely. He drove back toward Blackwood Creek, but this time he took back roads, using his knowledge of the local topography gained from Sarah's map. He swapped his easily recognizable Ranger for a nondescript rental car he'd secured near the city. His focus shifted from journalism to a tactical rescue. The psychological oppression had been exposed. Now it was time for action against the physical threat. He parked the rental in a hidden grove several miles from the Goler compound. He approached the property on foot, under the cover of a dense, cold fog that had rolled in from the river, muffling all sound. The weather, for once, was his ally. He moved toward the smokehouse entrance, the only way he knew in. The woodpile was undisturbed, but as he reached the hidden door, he saw a sign that chilled him. A small, fresh scrape mark on the old iron bolt. Someone had been there recently. The Golers had discovered his point of entry. Ethan paused, realizing that Jed had likely anticipated his return and was setting a trap. He abandoned the cellar entrance and circled the perimeter, keeping low in the fog. He found a small, neglected window on the side of the main house, half covered by overgrown ivy, leading into what appeared to be a laundry room. He used a small rubber mallet and a piece of tape to silence the glass, carefully tapping the window pane until it broke cleanly away. He slipped through the gap, landing silently on a pile of dusty laundry. The house was eerily silent. The Goler meeting must have concluded. He could hear a low murmur of voices from a room down the hall, likely the living area where the main family gathered. Ethan moved through the house, searching for any sign of Sarah. He passed the kitchen. Grandmother Goler's portrait stared silently from the wall. He reached the main living room door and listened. He heard Jed's voice, cold and authoritative. She will stay with Thomas. She can teach him the meaning of obedience. They can share the wall. The wall was their internal psychological boundary, the place where hope went to die. Sarah was now imprisoned with the most profound victim of the Goler cycle. Ethan carefully opened the door a crack. The room was sparsely furnished. Jed was sitting at the head of a long table, surrounded by several other family members, their faces bearing the distinct physical traits of their lineage, their expressions blank and hostile. Sarah was sitting silently next to Thomas, who stared fixedly at the opposite wall, muttering his broken phrases. Sarah looked defeated, her spirit crushed. Jed spoke, directing his words at his silent family. The outsider is still out there. He has our book, our history. If he speaks, the town, the police, they will come. We will not be ruined by a woman's weakness. We will find him and he will pay the price of silence. The atmosphere was thick with a shared, toxic loyalty. They were psychologically conditioned to view any outside interference as an existential threat. Their endogamy was their defense mechanism against the world. Ethan knew he couldn't confront them directly. He needed to get Sarah out, and he needed a distraction to force the Golers to scatter. He backed away, moving quickly and silently. He remembered the small utility shed behind the barn, where he had heard the logging saw earlier. He knew the Golers stored fuel and tools there. A fire, a large, loud distraction, was his only hope. It was a drastic step, but the safety of Sarah and the book's existence were paramount. He slipped out the laundry room window and raced toward the shed, the cold fog swirling around his feet. He could hear the low, distant baying of a hound starting up. Jed was mobilizing the hunt. The final, terrifying confrontation was about to begin. The cycle of fear had reached its violent climax. Ethan reached the utility shed, a rickety structure standing about 30 feet behind the main barn. The hound's barks were growing louder, closer. He had perhaps 2 minutes. He smashed the shed's padlock with a heavy stone he found nearby. Inside, the shed was stacked with jerry cans of gasoline, chainsaws and greasy rags, a perfect volatile distraction. He quickly doused the rags in the far corner of the shed with gasoline, pulling out a cheap lighter he'd bought in town. He hesitated for only a second. Fire was destructive, but the Goler compound, the physical manifestation of their psychological prison, had to be breached to save Sarah. He flicked the lighter. A rush of flame erupted immediately, hungry and loud. He slammed the shed door shut and sprinted toward the main house, circling toward the front entrance. A long, chilling howl erupted from the compound. It was not the dog. It was a Goler, alerting the others. Ethan reached the main house and kicked in the front door, the wood splintering loudly. He burst into the living room. The sight was chaotic. The Golers were scrambling, confused by the sudden localized fire. Jed, however, was already reacting, his face contorted in a mask of murderous fury. "You!" Jed roared, grabbing a rusted hunting rifle from above the fireplace mantel. "You think you can take our history? You think you can break our peace? Your peace is a prison." Ethan shouted back, his voice strained but steady. "Your history is a crime. I have the book, Jed. It's gone public. Your cycle ends now." He had to lie about the immediate publication to create a psychological deterrent. He had to convince Jed that the full truth was already beyond his control. Jed paused, his finger hovering over the trigger, the lie creating a momentary critical hesitation. But his conditioned hatred for the outside world was too strong. "No one cares. They only want to forget us. We are the truth." He raised the rifle. At that moment, the distraction Ethan had hoped for arrived. Little Thomas, startled by the noise, the fire and the sight of the outsider, stumbled to his feet. He didn't look at Ethan. He looked at the window, where the orange glow of the fire was beginning to reflect on the glass. For the first time in years, the crushing psychological wall in his mind cracked. He screamed, not a word, but a high-pitched, desperate sound of pure terror and long dormant life. He grabbed a heavy metal oil lamp from the table and, driven by an instinct Ethan could only interpret as a desperate final act of subversion against his own psychological trauma, he threw it. The lamp struck Jed in the head. The rifle discharged with a deafening blast, splintering the ceiling, but Jed stumbled, dropping the weapon. The distraction was all Ethan needed. He lunged across the room, grabbing Sarah's arm. "We're going, now!" Sarah, jolted from her defeat by the sight of Thomas's violent act of self-defense, found a surge of adrenaline. She clutched the back of Thomas's shirt. "Thomas, come!" The three of them scrambled out the broken front door. Behind them, the Goler family, a pack of psychologically conditioned wolves, were recovering, realizing their greatest threat was the outsider and the internal rebellion. Jed recovered quickly, his head bleeding, his eyes blazing with a psychopathic rage. "Get them! Don't let the woman and the boy escape!" Ethan, Sarah, and Thomas raced into the woods. The fire behind them was fully blazing now, casting grotesque, dancing shadows. The smoke was thick and acrid. They ran toward the back perimeter, the Golers in heavy pursuit. Thomas, surprisingly, found a reserve of strength, driven by the memory of Ilara Vance and his own shattered freedom. "The creek!" Sarah gasped, pulling Thomas toward the boundary stream. "The stream is the line." They reached the creek, the cold water a sudden shock to their bodies. They waded across, the terrain steep and slick. Behind them, they could hear the shouts and the crashing of bodies through the underbrush. Jed and two of his cousins emerged from the trees at the edge of the creek. Jed was holding a massive hunting knife, the glow of the fire reflecting in its polished steel. "You won't escape the blood, Sarah," Jed roared. "You carry the line. You carry the secret." Ethan shoved Sarah and Thomas up the opposite bank. He turned to face Jed, standing waist-deep in the freezing water. "Your secret is a lie, Jed," Ethan shouted, pulling out the small, secured flash drive containing the evidence. "And your cycle is broken. You are isolated now by your own truth." Jed, driven by generations of genetic and psychological programming to preserve the Goler isolation at any cost, plunged into the water, knife raised. He was driven by a primal, terrifying instinct. The two men met in a violent, desperate struggle in the dark, icy water of the creek. The fight in the creek was not a fair one. Jed Goler was stronger, hardened by years of manual labor and fueled by a fanatic, inherited loyalty to the clan's cycle. Ethan was driven by the evidence he carried and the need to protect Sarah and Thomas. Jed lunged, the knife flashing toward Ethan's chest. Ethan sidestepped, the blade catching his sleeve and ripping the fabric. The cold water slowed their movements, turning the fight into a vicious, desperate wrestling match. "You came to steal our history," Jed grunted, his face inches from Ethan's. "Our blood is our own. Your blood is a curse." Ethan retorted, managing to grab Jed's wrist, twisting the knife away. As they struggled, their feet slipped on the mossy rocks in the creek bed. They both went down, crashing into the frigid water. The knife skittered away, lost in the murk. Jed, now unarmed but completely enraged, scrambled for a better position, his hands wrapping around Ethan's throat. The psychological prison had become a physical one. Ethan was staring into the eyes of generational madness. Ethan, desperate for air, thrashed out, his hand instinctively reaching for the only solid thing nearby. A thick, submerged root from an ancient tree on the bank. He grabbed it and pulled with all his remaining strength, yanking Jed's head down and smashing it against a large, flat stone hidden beneath the water's surface. Jed went instantly limp, his grasp releasing. His heavy body was quickly pulled downstream by the strong current. Ethan gasped for air, crawling out of the creek, his body shaking from cold and adrenaline. The other Goler men, seeing their leader fall, hesitated, their primitive loyalty momentarily broken by shock. The fire at the utility shed, now a raging inferno, illuminated the scene with a terrifying, apocalyptic orange glow. Sarah rushed down the bank, her face stained with tears and smoke. "Ethan, he's gone." Ethan looked downstream. Jed's dark shape was already submerged, disappearing into the woods. He was defeated, either unconscious or dead, swallowed by the cold, unforgiving landscape he had sworn to protect. The Goler cousins stood paralyzed, watching the inferno and the creek swallow their leader. The psychological terror had turned on its master. "We have to go. Now," Ethan managed, his voice hoarse. He guided Sarah and the shell-shocked Thomas back through the dense forest, away from the compound. They walked for hours, until the sound of the fire and the shouts of the Golers were only faint, lingering echoes. They reached the back road where Ethan had left the rental car. He put Thomas, still staring silently at the wall of trees, in the back seat, and Sarah, trembling but resolute, in the passenger seat. As the sun began to rise, painting the sky with a clean, hopeful blue that contrasted sharply with the night's darkness, they drove away from Blackwood Creek. They stopped at the first major city, at a reputable police precinct, and then at a lawyer's office. Ethan immediately forwarded the full file, the photographs of the Book of Secrets, to his editor. The story was now public. The evidence of decades of systemic abuse, endogamy, and criminal negligence by a family and a complicit local system was now irrevocably in the hands of the world. The subsequent investigation, fueled by the irrefutable evidence of the book and the testimony of Sarah, was long and complex. The Goler clan was immediately isolated by a police cordon. The remaining adult members were apprehended. Little Thomas, the greatest victim of the psychological prison, was placed in the care of professionals who understood his trauma. Ethan visited Sarah 2 months later. She was living in a quiet suburban apartment, working for a small charity. Her face was still marked by the past, but her eyes held a new, fragile hope. "The cycle is broken, Ethan," she said, holding his hand. "They can't hurt Thomas anymore. They can't force the children to carry the lie." The true terror of the Goler clan wasn't the violence, but the insidious, psychological system of control that forced generations to repeat an abominable, inbred cycle. Ethan's investigation, fueled by a journalist's moral duty and the desperate courage of one woman, had exposed the truth. The story was a chilling testament to the fact that the most profound horrors are often those woven into the fabric of human silence and generational trauma, waiting for a single broken thread to finally unravel the whole.